Meet John Knowles, a notorious killer who was dubbed the Casanova Killer by the press. And no, it wasn't because he was a hopeless romantic, but because his striking looks and irresistible charm were his deadly weapons. Knowles left a trail of at least 20 murders across the country within a very short time, and he even claimed to have taken the lives of 35 individuals, although this was never verified by the investigators. Unlike some killers who meticulously stalk their prey, Knowles was a master of opportunistic killings, often driven by financial gain, particularly when he needed a new vehicle. He was a skilled escape artist who managed to break out of prison, and his charming demeanor could sway anyone with a simple smile. It seemed like Knowles was on a very intense killing spree, showing no mercy to anyone who crossed his path. He had no preference for killing men or women. Anyone who stood in his way or had something he wanted was fair game. Knowles was ruthless, not only taking their lives but also looting their belongings. Knowles was a killer like no other, a cold-blooded criminal whose good looks and smooth talking could fool anyone into a false sense of security. But what led him down this dark path, and how did he finally meet his end? Hi there, my name is Arthur and welcome back to Strange and Scary, and today we'll take a closer look at the life and crimes of Paul John Knowles, one of the most deadly serial killers in American history. Paul Knowles was born on April 17, 1946, in Orlando, Florida. Growing up, Knowles had a habit of getting into trouble with the law, mostly for minor offenses. Unfortunately, things only went from bad to worse when his father disowned him after one of his arrests, leaving Knowles to fend for himself. As a result, he was placed in foster care, a move that would have a significant impact on his life. As he progressed into his teenage years, Knowles continued to get into trouble, and eventually, his petty crimes landed him in reformatories, a place where young offenders who are unable to go to adult prisons are sent. The effects of foster care and reformatory life on young children and offenders have been widely researched and discussed. While it's unclear whether this played a role in shaping Knowles as an adult, studies have shown that foster care, in particular, can increase the likelihood of a child turning to violent crime. Knowles' past is a reminder that the experiences we have as children can have a significant impact on our adult lives. Despite his tumultuous upbringing, Knowles ultimately became a notorious killer who wreaked havoc across the country, leaving a trail of death and destruction in his wake. Knowles' life of crime started at a young age. At just 7 years old, he was caught stealing a bicycle and hauled away by the police. From then on, Knowles was in and out of trouble, with his rap sheet steadily growing. In 1968, he was arrested and charged with attempted burglary, which landed him a 3-year sentence at a Florida state prison, a sentence he served in full. But prison couldn't keep Knowles down. In 1971, he was released, only to be arrested again later that year for similar burglary charges, and sent straight back to prison. A year later, Knowles managed to escape from a prison work camp and went on the run for 3 weeks before being recaptured. This escapade earned him an additional 3 years added to his sentence. It was while he was incarcerated that Knowles caught the eye of a San Francisco cocktail waitress, Angela Kovic, who he corresponded with through letters. Angela was so taken with Knowles that she hired a criminal attorney to secure his early release. And it worked. Knowles was released from prison in May 1974, and he moved to California with Angela to start anew. Knowles' criminal past and daring escape from prison make for a gripping story. And with his newfound love in tow, it seemed like he might have a shot at redemption. But as we know, Knowles' story doesn't end here. It seemed like a match made in prison heaven. Knowles and Angela Kovic falling in love behind bars, with Angela eventually helping to secure his early release. But as with most tumultuous relationships, it wasn't meant to last. Angela had received a warning from a psychic that a dangerous man had entered her life, and it wasn't long before she saw Knowles' darker side for herself. With the relationship over, Knowles returned to Florida, but trouble was never far behind. Soon after his arrival, he was arrested for aggravated assault. He had stabbed a bartender during a fight. But prison walls couldn't hold him, and Knowles managed to escape again by picking the lock on his cell on July 26, 1974. This wasn't the end of Knowles' run-ins with the law. He later claimed to have killed 3 people on the same night Angela ended their relationship, although this has never been verified. Until then, Knowles had committed mostly petty crimes and hadn't shown a propensity for serious violence. Perhaps it was the end of the relationship that pushed him over the edge and set him on a path of murder and mayhem. The night Paul John Knowles escaped from his cell marked the beginning of a violent rampage that would spread across multiple counties. He broke into the home of an elderly woman, Alice Curtis, hoping to score some cash and valuable items. But things quickly took a tragic turn. Knowles bound and gagged 65-year-old Alice, who tragically choked to death on her dentures. It remains unclear whether she passed away before or after Knowles fled the scene in her Dodge Dart. Knowing that he was now a wanted fugitive, Knowles had to dispose of the car. He chose a random street and abandoned the vehicle, but as luck would have it, he stumbled upon 2 young girls, Lillian and Mylette Anderson, who he recognized from the Knowles family's acquaintances. Fearing that they might report him, Knowles kidnapped the girls and took them to a nearby swamp, where he brutally strangled and buried them. It was a shocking and horrific crime that would haunt investigators for years to come. But Knowles wasn't finished yet. He soon picked up a teenage hitchhiker, who turned out to be 13-year-old Imogen Sanders. She had run away from home and disappeared from Georgia in August of 1974. Knowles admitted to killing her, but provided no explanation for his heinous act. It would take decades to identify Imogen, but her tragic fate serves as a stark reminder of the senseless violence that Knowles was capable of. In Florida, he met Marjorie Howie, a 49-year-old woman whose fate is uncertain. Some say she willingly invited him into her apartment, while others believe Knowles forced his way in. Regardless, he ended up strangling her with a nylon stocking and stealing her television, which he may have given to a former girlfriend. Moving on to Musella, Georgia, Knowles found his way into the home of Kathy Sue Pierce, who was home with her 3-year-old son at the time. Knowles dragged her into the bathroom, where he killed her with a telephone cord he had cut. Though he spared the little boy any physical harm, the trauma of the experience would undoubtedly haunt him for years to come. By September, Knowles had made his way to Ohio, where he met William Bates, a 32-year-old account executive for Ohio Power Company, in a pub. The 2 men were seen leaving together, but Bates was never seen alive again. After his wife reported him missing, police found the Dodge Dart that once belonged to Knowles' first victim, Alice Curtis, at the bar, and Bates's car was missing. Bates's naked body was later discovered in the nearby woods, strangled to death by Knowles. With Bates's car in tow, Knowles drove all the way to Ely, Nevada, where he set up camp in a campground. On September 18, he turned his attention to Emmett and Lois Johnson, 2 elderly campers who had the misfortune of crossing his path. Bound and shot to death, the couple's murder initially puzzled authorities, who believed it to be a random act of violence. Despite Knowles using their credit cards for a time after their death, police had no idea he was behind the killings until he confessed to the heinous act. Unrelenting in his thirst for blood, Knowles struck again just 3 days later in Seguin, Texas. Charlene Hicks, stranded on the side of the road with a broken-down motorcycle, became his next victim. Abducted, taken advantage of, and eventually strangled to death with her own tights, Hicks' body was later found, dragged through a barbed wire fence, a gruesome reminder of the horrors Knowles inflicted upon his victims. In the fall of 1974, Knowles continued his deadly rampage and made his way to Birmingham, Alabama. There, he met Ann Dawson, a beautician, and the 2 embarked on a mysterious journey together. It's still unclear whether she went willingly or was forced, but Ann paid for everything until September 29, when Knowles killed her and disposed of her body in the Mississippi River. Her remains were never found. Later that October, Knowles broke into the home of Karen Wine and her daughter Dawn in Marlborough, Connecticut. The 2 women were tied up, taken advantage of, and strangled to death with a nylon stocking. Police only discovered a tape recorder missing from the home. The horrifying details of Knowles' crimes sent shockwaves through the community, and authorities scrambled to bring him to justice. On October 18, he entered the home of Doris Hosey, a seemingly random victim in Woodford, Virginia, and ruthlessly shot her to death with her husband's rifle. The police were baffled by the senseless act, and Knowles slipped away undetected, still driving the car of one of his earlier victims. In a stroke of luck, a police officer in Key West, Florida, pulled Knowles over for a routine traffic violation, unaware of his dangerous criminal history. Despite having 2 hitchhikers in the car with him, Knowles was let go with only a warning. However, the encounter unnerved him so much that he released his captives unharmed, and even sought the advice of his lawyer on how to turn himself in. Instead of surrendering, Knowles continued his deadly rampage, befriending Carswell Coer in Milledgeville, Georgia, on November 6. Little did Carswell know that he had welcomed a cold-blooded killer into his home for drinks and a place to stay for the night. The evening was dark and Knowles' actions even darker. He had stabbed Carswell to death, then strangled his own daughter. But Knowles didn't stop there. He was in Atlanta on November 8, where he met Sandy Fawkes, a British journalist, while knocking back drinks at a bar. Over the next few days, they spent time together, but despite their attempts, Sandy claimed Knowles was unable to perform sexually. Things took a sinister turn when Knowles picked up one of Sandy's friends, Susan McKenzie, and held her at gunpoint, demanding intercourse. Thankfully, she managed to escape and immediately reported the incident to the police. When the authorities tried to apprehend him, Knowles brandished a sawed-off shotgun and made a daring escape. But Knowles wasn't finished with his reign of terror. He soon surfaced in West Palm Beach, Florida, where he broke into the home of an invalid woman named Beverly Maybe and kidnapped her sister. Stealing their car, he drove to Fort Pierce, but what he did next was surprising. In an unusual turn of events, he released his hostage unharmed. It was a miracle that both women managed to escape the terrible fate that so many others had suffered at the hands of Knowles. On a fateful day in November 1974, Highway Patrol Trooper Charles Eugene Campbell spotted the car stolen by the notorious murderer Paul John Knowles near Perry, Florida. But the encounter quickly turned into a violent struggle, as Knowles overpowered the trooper and took him hostage, driving off in the patrol car. Along the way, Knowles picked up another hostage, James Mayer, but he had no intention of leaving any witnesses alive. In a wooded area, Knowles handcuffed both men to a tree and shot them in the head, but Knowles' luck was running out. A roadblock had been set up, and when he tried to crash through it, he lost control of the car and crashed into a tree. Knowles took off on foot, firing at the officers chasing him. The chase involved police dogs, helicopters, and multiple law enforcement agencies, but it was a civilian who ultimately brought an end to Knowles' escape. Several miles away from where the main search was being conducted, the civilian cornered Knowles at gunpoint and held him until the police arrived. With Knowles finally in custody, he quickly confessed to committing 35 murders, but authorities were only able to corroborate 20 of them. It was a shocking and gruesome end to the killing spree that had terrorized the country for months. But without the bravery and quick thinking of the civilian who apprehended Knowles, he might have escaped once again, leaving more innocent victims in his wake. In custody for his heinous crimes, Knowles made a shocking claim. He had ditched the pistol he had taken from Trooper Campbell, the one he used to take the trooper hostage, in Henry County, Georgia. Sheriff Earl Lee and Georgia Bureau of Investigation agent Ronnie Angel were tasked with taking Knowles to the location to try to retrieve the gun. As they traveled down Interstate 20, with Knowles securely handcuffed in the back seat, he suddenly made a bold move. He somehow managed to get hold of Lee's handgun, drawing it out of the holster and pointing it at the officers. In a moment of sheer panic, a life-and-death struggle ensued, with Knowles attempting to take control of the vehicle. But Angel was quick to act, firing 3 rounds into Knowles' chest, killing him instantly. It was a dramatic end to a chilling crime spree that had claimed the lives of at least 20 people. It was a dark and ominous night in Milledgeville, Georgia, when 2 hitchhikers, Edward Hilliard and Debbie Griffin, were last seen alive. The body of Edward Hilliard was discovered in the nearby woods, but the whereabouts of Griffin remained a mystery. All signs pointed to the infamous murderer, Knowles, who had a reputation for targeting unsuspecting hitchhikers. The authorities were convinced of his guilt, but a major setback hindered their investigation. The taped confession Knowles had given his lawyer before his capture was damaged, and the crucial information it contained was inaudible. Despite this, a determined team was able to piece together a handwritten summary of the recording, revealing the extent of Knowles' heinous crimes. Knowles' killing spree was notorious, and while he had initially claimed to have murdered 35 people, authorities had only been able to confirm 20. But as they dug deeper, more connections to Knowles were uncovered. The skeletal remains of a young woman, who had gone missing in 1974, were found, and the Georgia Bureau of Investigation traced a link to Knowles. He had been in the area at the time, and using the handwritten summary of his taped confession, authorities were convinced that this woman was one of Knowles' victims. The investigation continued, and it's possible that there are more victims of Knowles out there waiting to be uncovered. In 2011, the family of Imogene Sanders received news that they had been waiting for 37 long years. They were finally told that Ima had been one of the victims of the notorious serial killer, Knowles, during his murderous rampage. Ima's remains had been found in 1976, but it wasn't until recently that they were identified through DNA samples from her mother and sister. For all those years, her remains had been labeled as Unidentified Victim No. 5 and stored in a box at the Georgia State Crime Lab. Despite the passage of time, Ima's family had never given up hope of finding her and had tirelessly sought answers. They knew that Ima was likely a victim of Knowles, but until her remains were identified, they could not be certain. One of Ima's sisters, Sharon Cheshire, who was only 4 when Ima went missing, had a poignant memory of her sister telling her to lock the doors before leaving with friends. Sadly, Ima had been hitchhiking when Knowles picked her up, took advantage of her, and strangled her to death in the woods. Finally, after 37 years, her family could lay her to rest and find some closure knowing what had happened to her. In 1975, U.S. Attorney Ronald T. Knight wrote a bone-chilling letter that is believed to be related to Ima's death and was given to the authorities. Part of the letter read, "A young hitchhiker named Alma who was picked up by Knowles during his killing spree." The letter describes in graphic detail how Knowles took advantage of and strangled her before leaving her body in the woods. Despite the body being moved by animals, Knowles found her jawbone and buried it in the same area. Investigators later discovered that the victim's real name was Imogene Sanders, a 13-year-old girl who had been missing for 37 years. It took over 3 decades to match her remains with her identity through DNA testing. Betty Wiscup, Ima's mother, had never given up hope of finding her daughter and continued to search for information about her whereabouts. The authorities were able to identify Ima as the victim due to a combination of the transcript from one of Knowles' audio tapes and the letter written by U.S. Attorney Ronald T. Knight. Despite the loss of Ima's original missing persons report, justice was finally served for Imogene Sanders. It's easy to see why many were drawn to Knowles. With his long red hair, slight stubble, and a cigarette perpetually dangling from his lips, he had a striking appearance that was considered downright sexy in his time. But his charm was more than skin deep. Knowles had a way with words and could easily persuade others, particularly women, with his smooth-talking ways. His former partner, Sandy Fox, attested to this, describing him as the type of man who would rush to her aid or wrap a coat around her shoulders if she looked cold. However, the gifts he gave her were not the result of a kind heart, but rather the spoils of his murder victims. Contrary to the belief that serial killers lack education or culture, Knowles was a voracious reader, often indulging in books about outlaws like Bonnie and Clyde, John Dillinger, and Babyface Nelson. One of his favorite books was Jonathan Livingston Seagull by Richard Bach, which tells the story of a bird that longs for freedom. Perhaps Knowles saw something of himself in the character. While Knowles claimed to have killed 35 people, it's possible that he exaggerated his number to enhance his notoriety. His primary goal was to become famous, and with a list of 20 murders already attributed to him, he may have wanted to ensure that his legacy was even grander. During his imprisonment, Knowles never showed any remorse or guilt for his actions. In fact, he described the murders with pride, relishing the attention he received for his crimes. It's a pity that he was killed before any psychological assessment could be conducted, as it would have been fascinating to see what diagnosis he would have received. The name Paul John Knowles still sends shivers down the spines of those who were involved in the case of the notorious serial killer. Officer Jimmy Josie, who was a member of the Milledgeville Police, remembers Knowles as a cold-blooded killer with no apparent motive for his gruesome crimes. "He was tough. He was mean. He had no compunction about killing you," Josie recalled. Knowles was an expert in martial arts, making him even more dangerous to his victims. Former Special Agent Roy Harris of the Georgia Bureau of Investigation also has haunting memories of the case, particularly of the day they investigated the murders of Carswell Kerr and his 15-year-old daughter Mandy. "Seeing a child like that is just awful. It's something I remember to this day," he said. According to Josie, Knowles was fully aware of what he had done and where he was headed. "They're going to smoke me before this is over," he reportedly said after being fingerprinted and photographed. Even when he was taken to the county jail, he refused to reveal the whereabouts of Trooper Charles Campbell, whom he had taken hostage. When asked about the trooper's location, Knowles merely smirked and said, "You know I can't tell you that." The memory of Paul John Knowles still lingers, and his final resting place in the Jacksonville Memory Gardens, Clay County, Florida, is a chilling reminder of his evil deeds. That was the case of Paul John Knowles, and always remember to be safe. Thanks for watching, and remember to subscribe. Check out my other videos on your screen.